Good morning, Year 11. Today we are continuing our exploration of how Shakespeare uses Banquo as a foil character to the hero Macbeth. So this is video 2. In video 1, we were looking at this extract here from Act 1, Scene 3. We were looking at how Shakespeare in this scene uses Banquo to juxtapose our hero Macbeth. We're remembering that a foil character, is a character that completely contrasts with another character. Now, having dealt fully with the extract at 1 Scene 3, we now need to choose a counterpoint, another moment in the play where we also see Shakespeare using Banquo as a foil to Macbeth. So today we're going to have a look at Act 3, Scene 4, the banquet scene. Now we know from our working class that during this feast, during this banquet, the ghost of Banquo appears. Lady Macbeth and Macbeth are hosting this feast as a symbol of their royalty. It's sending a message to all of Scotland about how great their reign is going to be. They really need this feast to go well. Now, at this feast, the ghost of Banquo appears, and we know that only Macbeth can see this ghost. That's because the ghost of Banquo is an embodiment, a manifestation of Macbeth's guilty conscience. The ghost is there to point out and highlight the things that Macbeth has done wrong. So the scene starts with the arrival of the 3 murderers. And these murderers have some tragic, harrowing news for Macbeth. Macbeth has sent the murderers, has sent the hired killers, the assassins, to kill Banquo and his son Fleance. Macbeth is torn apart with fear that Banquo's sons will one day be king. Macbeth is torn apart with fear that if that's true, he has killed Duncan for nothing. He has placed a barren sceptre and a fruitless crown upon his own head. And so in his desperation, he hires these 3 killers to go after his friend Banquo and his son Fleance. Now the murderers arrive at the banquet and they tell Macbeth Fleance has escaped. Most royal sir, Fleance is escaped. And at this moment in time, Macbeth is overcome with a wave of panic and fear. Then comes my fit again. I am cabined, cribbed, confined, bound in to saucy doubts and fears. We see that Macbeth feels trapped. The walls of his fear are closing in. He starts to feel claustrophobic. This image here on the left perfectly sums up how Macbeth is feeling at this point in time. He feels trapped, claustrophobic. His own evil actions, the sins he has committed, are trapping him, confining him. There's a sense of irony there. He's brought this upon himself. So, having heard that Fleance escaped, Macbeth asks, "But Banquo's safe. Banquo's dead." To which the murderer replies, "Ay, my good lord, safe in a ditch he bides, with 20 trenched gashes on his head, the least a death to nature." So Banquo is in a ditch, left for dead in a ditch, with 20 stab wounds to his head. We're told that one of these stab wounds alone would be enough to kill anyone who is natural, the least a death to nature. One of these stab wounds would be enough to kill anybody who is natural. Now this word choice foreshadows the supernatural arrival of Banquo, the supernatural survival of Banquo. Banquo has in some way survived. His ghost has survived, and it foreshadows the fact that the ghost will any minute arrive at this feast. Now, before the ghost comes in, Macbeth makes a toast. "Here had we now our country's honoured roof, were the graced person of our Banquo present." Macbeth is being very cunning, very sly. He knows that Banquo is dead in a ditch, and yet he stands up and puts on a performance and says, "Oh, if only Banquo were here! If only Banquo were here, he would grace our company with his presence. If only Banquo were here! I wish Banquo were with us." Now, Macbeth needs to be very careful what he wishes for. If only Banquo were here. He comes to regret these words because moments later Banquo arrives. Banquo attends the feast as a ghost, and this is a moment of utter terror. The ghost of Banquo arrives at the feast, and Macbeth is in utter terror. Which of you has done this? You cannot say I did it. Never shake your gory locks at me. So the ghost arrives, and Banquo comes to point out Macbeth's evil sins and the terrible wicked actions he has taken. He is an embodiment, a manifestation of Macbeth's guilty conscience. And once again, like earlier in the play, in Act 1, Scene 3, we see that Banquo is warning Macbeth. Banquo is cautioning Macbeth. So let's have a look at what the ghost does. Let's have a look at how Shakespeare presents the ghost. Now, the first thing we see is when the ghost of Banquo enters, he sits in Macbeth's place. He sits at Macbeth's chair at the table, possibly even Macbeth's throne. So what does this convey? Well, it's a clear threat. It's a warning. And possibly by sitting in Macbeth's throne, in sitting in Macbeth's place, by taking Macbeth's place, Banquo is sending Macbeth a reminder that one day his sons will be king. One day his sons will sit upon the throne of Scotland. It's also perhaps a reminder that Macbeth is unworthy to sit upon that throne. Macbeth is evil and sinful. He does not deserve to wear the crown. He does not deserve to sit upon the throne. The second thing the ghost does is he shakes his head. He shakes his locks, his hair at Macbeth. Never shake thy gory locks at me. Now we understand the shaking of a head to mean no. And the ghost is saying no. He's saying no to Macbeth's evil deeds. He's condemning Macbeth for his wicked actions. He is warning Macbeth, no more. You will do no more harm, no more bloodshed, no more murder. So the ghost shakes his head to say no to Macbeth's evil deeds. And the last thing we're told in this scene is that the ghost glares at Macbeth, stares at him. So this is very intimidating. The ghost is glaring at Macbeth. Banquo is glaring at Macbeth. Now this implies that Banquo's eyes, his supernatural eyes, will always be on Macbeth. Banquo will always be watching him. And he's warning Macbeth, change your ways. This is intimidating to Macbeth, this idea that he's constantly being watched by this higher force, this ghost of Banquo. Perhaps it's a reminder too to the Christian audience that the eyes of God are upon us all and will see all of our wicked deeds and sins. So Shakespeare cleverly shows these dramatic actions. The ghost sitting in Macbeth's place upon his throne, shaking his head, glaring at Macbeth. All of these are warnings to Macbeth. Banquo is cautioning Macbeth. So we can see that even in death, even when he's a ghost, Banquo is still noble. He's still an honourable man. Now what is Macbeth's reaction? He says, you can't say, I killed you. You cannot say I did it. Thou canst not say I did it. So the ghost has come to warn and accuse, but Macbeth immediately tries to deny any responsibility. He tries to get himself off the hook. He tries to acquit himself. Well, what does this tell us about Macbeth? It tells us that he will not accept responsibility. He is irresponsible. It also tells us he has no honour. He is dishonourable. Lady Macbeth says to her husband at this moment, what? Quite unmanned in folly. This tells us that Macbeth, his foolishness, his folly, is emasculating him. His nervous, panic-stricken reaction to the ghost is unmanning him, is emasculating him. So let's recap. Let's look at how Shakespeare presents Banquo and Macbeth here in the banquet scene. Now we've seen that Banquo, his ghost, even though he's dead, even though he's reaching out from beyond the grave, his actions, his intentions are still noble and honourable. The ghost comes to warn Macbeth, Banquo once again cautioning Macbeth against evil. We could argue that Banquo's ghost acts as Macbeth's conscience, a reminder of what is right and what is wrong. Banquo's ghost reminds Macbeth of his evil deeds, and it reminds Macbeth Banquo is watching him. This is intimidating. The ghost is provoking Macbeth to change, to stop his evil bloodshed and to change his ways. Now, in complete juxtaposition, Macbeth is scared and pathetic. He tries to deny responsibility. He tries to cover up what he's done. All of this prove that Macbeth is ever more evil, ever more selfish. Now, if we're writing about Banquo as a foil to Macbeth in this scene, first of all, we want to set out our understanding of what Shakespeare is doing. We want to communicate the AO1, the writer's ideas. We want to show the examiner we know exactly how Shakespeare is using Banquo as a foil to Macbeth. So we would write, in the banquet scene, Shakespeare once again uses Banquo as a foil to Macbeth. Even though Banquo is now dead, he remains noble and honourable. He comes as a ghost to embody Macbeth's guilty conscience. Banquo again points out Macbeth's wrongdoing and warns him to change his ways. Now, having set out the big ideas, what Shakespeare is doing, we're now going to drill down into the AO2, the writer's methods and the meaning they create for the reader, for the audience. So the how. How does Shakespeare use Banquo as a foil? Shakespeare begins this scene with Macbeth receiving harrowing, terrible news. Fleance has escaped. This causes Macbeth to become cabined, cribbed, confined. This lovely triplet allows us to understand that Macbeth feels trapped, hemmed in by his own wicked deeds. Shakespeare creates a sense of claustrophobia. We can sense the walls of guilt closing in around Macbeth. Macbeth then tempts fate by pretending to wish Macbeth was there to honour his roof. However, Macbeth comes to regret this wish as Banquo turns up as a ghost moments later. The ghost of Banquo comes as an embodiment of Macbeth's guilty conscience. Shakespeare uses Banquo to point out Macbeth's evil deeds and to warn Macbeth to change his ways. Shakespeare uses a range of dramatic action to show Banquo warning Macbeth. Firstly, the ghost enters and sits in Macbeth's place. This is clear provocation. Banquo is taunting Macbeth, reminding Macbeth that one day his sons will sit on Macbeth's throne. Secondly, the ghost shakes his head at Macbeth. This implies Banquo is condemning Macbeth, possibly warning Macbeth to do no more harm. Lastly, the ghost glares at Macbeth, suggesting that Banquo's eyes will be forever on Macbeth. Now this intimidates, it unnerves our hero. Banquo, even in death, is noble and honourable, and he reaches out to caution, to warn Macbeth to change his ways. So we've got a lovely clear what, a thoughtful how, and we're thinking now about the why. Why is Shakespeare using Banquo's ghost in this way at this moment? Why this? Why now? What are Shakespeare's big ideas? And we're remembering the question, Banquo as a foil to Macbeth. So what is it that Shakespeare is doing here? In the banquet scene and throughout the play, Shakespeare uses the good and noble Banquo as a complete and utter foil to Macbeth's vaulting ambition and his evil deeds, his evil actions. In life, Banquo warned Macbeth against trusting the instruments of darkness. And even now in death, as a ghost, Banquo reaches out from beyond the grave to caution, to warn his friend. Banquo serves as Macbeth's conscience, trying to pull his friend back from his fantastical actions. However, even this terrifying encounter with Banquo's blood-boltered ghost is not enough to stop Macbeth from giving in to his hamartia and sliding to his eternal downfall. So we've got a lovely analysis here of how Shakespeare is using Banquo as Macbeth's conscience to warn Macbeth, and it's a reminder that in the grand scheme of Macbeth's narrative arc as a hero, Macbeth is a hero, he has his hamartia of vaulting ambition, and it's a reminder that even though this ghost comes as a warning, it's all too little to stop Macbeth's downfall.